It's a lot. It's a lot of work, I can tell. It's a lot of things that you went over here. But as simply as you can you summarize this study? Um, I know that's real difficult, but if you could summarize it, how would you do that?
Yeah. Basically, we were looking at what distinguishes children who grow up to behave violently and from children who grow up and don't behave violently. And we knew from past research that a major factor was observation of violence as they're growing up, and particularly when they're younger growing up. And there are lots of psychological reasons for that. Humans are great imitators, and they're born with that, not just ability, tendency to do that. They imitate facial expressions at a very young age and then imitate behavior. Children see, children do is a rule that psychologists know. So we believed that that was likely to happen. So we looked at all sorts of things as children were growing up in the study that we thought might predict later violence. And we started with children in the 2nd, 4th, and 9th grade in Flint, Michigan. We picked Flint, Michigan because it had a very high rate of violent behavior in young adults at this time. So we needed, one of the problems when you're studying violence is that even though we're very concerned about it generally, the rate of violence overall is not that high. So if you want to get lots of examples of violence, you have to start with an area where there is lots of violence. So that's why we started with Flint. And we followed them from the 2nd, 4th, and 9th. First, immediately for 3 years, 2nd graders, 3rd and 4th, 4th, 5th, 6th, 9th, 10th, 11th. And then we followed up later on several times, including one time just most recently about 10 years after the initial time. So children were followed up in the when they actually became young adults. And we looked when they were young adults at who committed violent crimes, who was aggressive, who behaved physically aggressively against other people. And then we tried to predict that from the measures we'd taken much earlier, up to 10 years earlier, including their exposure to neighborhood gun violence and their exposure to media violence and their exposure to video game violence. And we found that exposure to video game violence was a very significant predictor of behaving violently when they'd grown up to be adults. Exposure to neighborhood violence was too. So that's kind of a brief summary.
Was the exposure to video game violence higher than neighborhood violence?
Well, that's kind of hard to say because there's really measured different ways. Video game violence we measured by asking them what their favorite things to do were, favorite games to play, and then we had all those games rated for the amount of violence in them. Exposure to neighborhood violence we assessed both by asking them had they seen people being shot, being beaten up, so on in their neighborhood. We asked their parents if their kids had seen those things. And we also had measures of police reports about how much violence there was in the neighborhood. So so we're pretty confident we have good measures of those, but it's hard to really compare the exposure to video game or media violence with the exposure to neighborhood violence because they're qualitatively different.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned that the kids would tell you what types of games they were playing, and then you would determine them to be violent or how violent they were. Can you talk about how you determined?
Yeah, what we did is we had, we actually ended up with a list of almost, I think, about 1,000 different video games that, and each of those video games was not only named by a child as their favorite game. We asked them how often they played it. And then we took those games, that list of games, and had a bunch of college students who we trained who had played the game or seen the game played, rate them for violence on a scale of 0 to 4. And each game got a score from each rater, and then we took the average score of all the raters after we did some controls to get rid of, obviously, ratings that were invalid and raters who weren't doing a good job. And so we ended up with a violence rating for each game. So, for example, top violence ratings would be games like Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, Halo. I'm not a big player of those games at that time, but those I recall were the some of the highest violent games.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, Halo is very much futuristic fantasy, but it's up there with Call of Duty, which has been called very realistic in today's standards. And of course, Grand Theft Auto is very lifelike.
Right.
I want to ask you something specifically that I read in the study on page 27. It said that nevertheless, the results of this study do not establish a causal relation between early exposure to violence and subsequent gun or other weapon use. Is that statement reiterating that watching violent media or playing violent games does not specifically cause violence or mass violence like a mass shooting?
No, it's not saying it does not cause. It's saying that this kind of study, it's kind of like, think of it as a jury trial. You can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the exposure to violence caused the violent behavior. We are confident that exposure to violence increases the risk of violent behavior. That's, I'm certain in saying, but I wouldn't say exposure to violence causes a specific violent behavior. Violent behavior, when it occurs, it actually never occurs just due to one factor. People behave violently when there's a convergence of a set of factors, some of which are internal and some of which are external. So it's anybody who says one thing caused a violent act is really wrong from the start.
Okay.
But I think I'm confident in saying extensive exposure to violent video games when a child is growing up increases the risk that they will behave violently later on, for sure.
On that page, it goes on to say that only a true experiment or randomized trial could establish that, and such a study is not likely to be done because of ethical issues. Can you explain what that means?
Very simply, if you wanted to show that a video game, particular violent video game, caused someone to shoot someone, you could devise an experiment where there was one randomly selected set of youth that would watch the video game, another randomly selected set of youth that would watch a nonviolent game, and then hand everybody guns and put them in a situation where someone annoys them and see who shoots them. Well, that's obviously unethical to do.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Okay.
When the dependent variable, the outcome variable, is shooting someone, you can't really have a true kind of experiment, the kind that we can do with drugs, for example, to show drugs prevent certain illnesses and so on.
Based on your findings, what should communities or state or federal lawmakers be looking at to lower the risk of violence and firearm violence among youth and young adults?
Well, it really starts, I think, with parents in the family. Uh, my recommendation, and just the recommendation of just about every uh, psychologist I know who studies this area, would be that parents uh, prevent children from playing violent video games until certainly they're uh, older teenagers. One of the factors that's more subtle, but it comes out in the studies, is that age matters, because the way we learn scripts for behavior starts very early, and once the scripts are formed, they become crystallized and they're very hard to change. So the downside to that is it really matters what children who are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 do and see. Children see, children do, and it's not going to influence them just immediately long term. The upside to it is by the time a child grows up to be 16, 17, 18, 19, then they're much less likely to be affected long term by what they see. So, so while I would say prevent children from playing violent video games until they're teenagers, when older teens and young adults, I think playing violent video games is not likely to have a long-term effect. We know it has a short-term effect. When you get done playing a violent video game, you're aroused and so on, and you may behave more aggressively, but it's unlikely to have a long-term effect because of the way developmental psychology works. Your scripts are formed when you're younger.
I know this game wasn't available at the time when you started this study, but considering you mentioned Halo, Fortnite's a big video game that kids play nowadays because it's very cartoony, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
If you were to do a study in today's age, you think that game would probably line up with others as being violent?
I do. And one of the things we found both with video games, but also with television media and movie media, is that it doesn't matter if the characters are look realistic or not. It's the way they're created to make the child identify with them. If the child identifies with the character, it can be a cartoon character, a real character, an animal, that behavior of that character is unlikely to be imitated. Identification is the important thing, not how realistic, excuse me, the character looks.
Okay. Another question I had, and I know you're not a lawyer, so you can say you don't want to answer this, but the Uvalde families, I'm sure you're aware, are suing the developers of Call of Duty, arguing that it groomed the shooter into committing the mass shooting, teaching him how to use weapons modeled after real guns. Based off what you know, does that sound like a sound argument? It seems like lawsuits like this kind of are never successful.
Well, they're never successful or seldom successful for legal reasons. The one with the Sandy Hook children was successful because they really, it was said that they were marketing, and it wasn't, so they avoided the First Amendment issues mostly. I think the Uvalde case has a good basis, at least some parts. Certainly, companies selling violent video games are really marketing them to kids who are younger than kids should be to play the game. And when you start playing young and grow up playing that game, then you develop scripts that last and normative beliefs that this is the norm. And so the Uvalde shooter could have grown up believing that this is okay, this is something to do. And when something makes them angry, made him angry, then this is the way he carries it out. So there's two things that, are really required for mass shooting. The shooter has to be really angry and at the target or something that's going to be hurt by the shooting. And then the shooter has to have this idea of how to do it. And certainly playing the violent video games gives them the idea of how to do it and the script for how to do it. And if you see a lot of violence, even if it's quite different than what you're carrying out, then you become desensitized to violence and it seems normative, and that makes it much easier. So I think they have a case on that basis.
Okay. This just real quick, the word scripts, I've read it a lot in these papers. But to say it in, I guess, layman's terms, if I have a script, would that be like my solution? In my head, that is a solution to a problem?
Yeah,
Or-
so we all engage, think of children faced with a social problem solving situation. They're playing out and there's some potential conflict with other kids. How do they solve it? They think about, well, what do I know? How do I solve this? What can I do? And the solution they come up with is a script for how they behave. And if they do this over and over again, that script becomes encoded in their brain and will be repeated. Some kids develop mostly aggressive scripts. Other kids develop mostly non-aggressive scripts. We know that if you're watching a lot of media violence, you see a lot of violence in the neighborhood, playing a lot of violent video games, you're much more likely to develop aggressive scripts, guides for how to behave, because that's how you see everyone else behaving.
Okay.
Particularly those with whom you identify.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this. When I first reached out to you, I asked you if there was any recent research happening, to which you replied, it's not the best to try to focus only on research done very recently. You said the best research usually takes years. Can you explain why that matters in your own words? Because I think that's important to this story, that these things take time.
Yeah. Well, the number one reason is that humans develop over a long period of time. And I mean, an individual human, we're born and then we have a childhood and adolescence and a young adulthood and then an adulthood. And we know that, for example, most violence is committed after people are in their teenage years later on. But a lot of the sources for that behavior are before that. So this means the best kind of studies have to be done longitudinally. That is, just like this Flint study was. You examine children when they're young and then look to see how they behave 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. So that takes time. Now, if you can do an experiment like we talked about, sometimes you can do an experiment. For example, some of the best experiments on media violence were done by a man named Albert Bandura, professor at Stanford, who showed that very young kids who saw models beating up Bobo dolls were more likely to behave aggressively afterwards. That was a true experiment. He had one group saw them, one group didn't, and they looked at how they behaved afterwards, whether they behaved aggressively. And so that can be done in the short term. But the real world studies that are going to tell us a lot more have to be done in the long term, and that takes time.
Video games continue to evolve graphically, and as we get closer to being fully immersed in digital worlds, do you fear at all that we are in danger of more violence or violent behavior if we don't take some kind of action?
Well, I do. And it's not because games are evolving. The current level of games is enough. I mean, it promotes violence, unfortunately, and it makes violence normative, and it provides scripts to follow for violent behavior. It suggests that the solution to problems is violence, and that's a bad thing to be putting out there.
Yeah.
Now, I should, at this point, I should make one plea about gun violence. You know, no matter what we do about video games, media violence, and so on, if we can't do something about restricting the number of guns that are out there, particularly automatic rifles, we're going to have very sad mass shootings for a long time.
Yeah, I think I read that point in another one of the papers that you shared with me, access to guns being one of the variables here.
Yeah, I say that because some people have tried to play these off against each other. They say, well, people who blame media violence are just trying to avoid blaming guns. And that's not true. Obviously, we'd be better off having being less awash in a sea of guns. But given that we'd be much better off being less awash in a sea of violent video games and violent movies and violent TV.
Last question I had for you is whether you're allowed to share if you're working on anything or researching anything currently that we might see come out in the next few years involving this topic.
Well, one of the things we're looking at, which is interesting, is that the extent to which what we call normative beliefs, that is, beliefs about whether what's okay to do, the extent to which that moderates the effect of seeing violence. Particularly, we believe that if you have beliefs more accepting of violence, you're more likely to imitate the violence you see. So the observing violence is more likely to stimulate more violence in youth who already believe that violence is not so bad. It's part of the world. It's okay.
Okay.
And we're working on some analyses to show that. The other thing that might be interesting to people is that a study we have actually mostly finished that we did in Israel and Palestine over the past 10 years, where we looked at kids exposed to war violence. Because, I mean, we're talking about video game violence here and video violence, but neighborhood violence or war violence is a way you're exposed to violence. And what we found is that kids who were exposed to more war violence in Palestine, Palestinian kids or Israeli kids, were more likely 5 to 10 years later to behave violently against their own peers, not against the other ethnic group, against their own peers, which psychologically, I'm sure that wouldn't make sense to a number of people, but psychologically it makes sense because they're learning scripts to solve problems by behaving violently. So if you have a problem with your own in-group, solve it with violence. And we found very significant effects there.
That's fascinating. Professor, I'm sorry we had issues yesterday, but I'm so glad that we got that figured out. And I learned something new about computers thanks to what happened yesterday. So hopefully neither of us will face that issue in the future.
Can you say your name for me so I could pronounce it correctly?
Sure. My first name is Augustine, like St. Augustine, and my last name is Garfias.
Okay, Augustine Garfias.
Yes. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You didn't have anything else to add on our conversation? I think we're good to go.
Yeah, good.
All right.
Well, wait, just one question. So
sure.
What's going to happen? What's going to be the outcome of this interview?
So my next plan or stage is to, originally I was going to speak to a Marine veteran who was also an avid Call of Duty player, but the subject changed once I met you and we started talking about adolescence and growing up playing violent video games. So I'm gonna try to see if I can go to a local esports center here in town, and they have safeguards in place so kids can't play certain games when they're left
Mhm.
there because parents tend to drop their kids off there. But I asked you the Fortnite question because they do a lot of Fortnite there, and those kids are young. And so, they might not like me asking these questions, which is fair game. They're a business, but I'm going to give them a call and just see if I can find a parent or someone who can talk to me about monitoring their children's
That's
gameplay.
good.
And then from there, we'll put the story together.
Okay.
Try to keep it quick.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes me want to just make two comments. One
sure.
about the Marine. Uh, what I said before is, I think, relevant. I mean, I think an adult, like the age of a Marine and 20s, 30s, and so on, I don't think they're going to be affected by playing a violent video game
Mhm.
like a 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old is. So I'm certainly not forcefully objecting to that. The other thing is just interesting when you ask parents, is that parents don't really understand the deleterious effect of video violence, either violence in video games, violence in TV, violence in movies. Uh, if they reacted the same as most parents do to pornographic scenes, they, they wouldn't let their kids see a lot of the stuff or play with all of the games they do.